starts with a happier note. It starts with a man named Bill Brown in Ottumwa, Iowa. Now, Bill Brown loved pumpkins. He loved pumpkins so much he planted 4 different pumpkin fields. He had one that grew huge pumpkins, and they were over 1,000 pounds. For 2 years, he actually held a world record for the largest pumpkin ever grown. He had a field for beautiful pumpkins. These were perfectly shaped, perfectly colored, perfect stems. He would even go out and stick a soft cotton blanket underneath them to keep the bottom from rotting. The 3rd field was for his sweet pumpkins. He would fertilize them with special fertilizers, and they were used for pumpkin pies and pumpkin spices. And his 4th field was where he dug up all the old pumpkins that didn't fit and planted them there. It was his ugly pumpkin field. And that field was where he kept the pumpkins he used for scarecrows, or he just plowed them under and used them as fertilizer. But Bill Brown knew the Iowa State Fair was coming up in 2 weeks, and he had won every single category in the Iowa State Fair for over 30 years when it was related to pumpkins. And he knew this was his year again. His pumpkins were perfect. But that night he was sitting out on his front porch and a flaming ball came out of the sky. Whether it was an asteroid, a meteorite, or spaceship, we may never know. It's landed in his beautiful pumpkin patch and cut a streak all the way across into the ugly pumpkin patch, and it set fires all around it. Bill Brown was terrified it was going to burn all 4 patches, so he ran to the trawl, grabbed the bucket of water, ran over and started dousing the fires, and when he got to the object, he noticed it was sitting on top of the ugly scarecrow. You'd have to build a new scarecrow for that field. He slung the water on the object. And when steam came off of it, he looked again, and the scarecrow that was underneath was gone. What? No. It must have burned up. It must have been his imagination. It wasn't there at all. Bill Brown knew after he got all the fires out, he was exhausted. He had enough of his pumpkins. He would be fine for the fair. Bill Brown went inside, crawled into bed, and went to sleep. But about 3 o'clock in the morning, he heard something out in his front yard. And then he heard it on his front porch. And nobody locks their doors in Ottumwa, Iowa, but maybe after this they should. He heard the door open. And then he heard whatever it was coming across the front hall toward his bedroom. And when the door came open, there was a man standing there with a pumpkin head and arms and legs made out of vines. And the creature stood over Bill Brown and said, you're a murderer. Every time you stab a knife into a pumpkin skull, and you cut out his brains, and you stab a knife into his eyeball, you are killing our, ancestors. But he said, Bill Brown, I'm going to let you live, sort of. Bill Brown felt the vines wrap around his leg, snatch him out of bed, and drag him across the front hall out the door. And now, Bill Brown was never seen again, at least not in a human form. But the next 2 weeks passed, and when Bill Brown didn't show up for the pumpkin registration at the Iowa State Fair, the fair director was worried something bad had happened. The only thing that would keep Bill Brown away was death. So he went and got the sheriff, and they drove out to Bill Brown's house. When they pulled up in the front, all the crops had been taken in. The pumpkin patches were empty. Everything looked fine. So the sheriff went and knocked on the door. And inside he heard a voice, "Come in!" When he opened the door and walked in, he walked across the living room into the hall, and sitting there at the kitchen table was a creature with a pumpkin head, dressed in Bill Brown's clothes with vines for arms and legs. But that wasn't even the strangest thing. Across from this creature was a creature that was a little smaller and had a dress on and looked kind of like a pumpkin-headed woman. And on either side were two smaller pumpkin creatures that if you didn't know better, you would say it was just a family having dinner. But Bill Brown doesn't have any family. Now the strange creature turned to the sheriff and said, "Sheriff, you want something to eat?" No. Now the sheriff didn't know what pumpkin-headed creatures ate, but he did know one thing. He didn't want to find out. Ah! Ah! He ran as fast as he could out the front door, jumped in the car with the director right behind him. They sped off. And on their way back to town, they agreed that they could not tell this story to anyone because everyone would think they had lost their minds. And that could have been the end of the story. But after that, people started reporting that they were seeing these pumpkin-headed creatures in the fields all around Bill Brown's farm. And then people started disappearing all over Ottumwa, Iowa. And in 5 years, the entire town was run by pumpkin-headed aliens of some sort. And now, every time you stab that pumpkin this year and you scoop out the brains and the guts, remember you might be killing one of their ancestors. And one day, Ottumwa, Iowa might not be enough, and they might decide to come visit you for murdering their relatives.